Hello. This is week one's lecture on art and design. This week and in this lecture, we will be exploring the relationship between art and design. Art and design are everywhere. They shape the products we use, the media we consume, the spaces we move through, and even the way we communicate identity, emotion, and culture. This lecture introduces art and design not simply as objects we look at, but as ways of thinking, making, and understanding the world. Throughout the course this summer, we'll explore how artists and designers, creators and makers develop ideas, solve visual problems creatively, and use the creative process to communicate meaning. So, what is the relationship between art and design? Well, they often overlap and are interconnected. Generally, we'll say that fine art is primarily a visual medium that expresses ideas about our human experience in the world. The purpose of design, most typically, is almost always to motivate the audience to do something, to buy a product, to use a service, to visit a location, or to learn certain information. Now, the tools and tactics used to create something like a fine art piece you might see in a gallery or a museum are often overlapping and integral to a design process that's used to communicate a message to motivate an audience. So here's some examples, two examples of something that might be more design heavy in the realm of motivating an office. That's for commodification or a more commercial process. And then an image that's a fine art piece. So on the left here, you see this really heavily graphically designed poster that's for a show at a coffee shop. We see that there's a workshop, there's maybe live music, there's a schedule, there's a date. This is something that's indicating something's going on. We're being invited to attend as an audience. We know there's going to be coffee. Something is being sold to us. On the right, something is being communicated to us. This is a self-portrait by artist Ana Mendieta that challenged a lot of notions of femininity, beauty, identity, and place in the world. So here in this portrait, Ana Mendieta put on facial hair, which normally she doesn't have. She is communicating something, a message about identity, sense of self, place in the world. To the left, it is engaging an audience to participate, to attend, to buy coffee. So this is kind of where art and design may differentiate. Now, visual design is a universal language that expresses ideas, emotions, and identities. It influences perception, storytelling, and brand communication in every medium. So if communication is the exchange of ideas, then art and design are visual languages. They're more than just aesthetics, right? It is that communication through the elements and principles of design language. And we're going to learn those elements and principles of that design language next week. But in this visual language, instead of sentences and grammar, artists, designers, creators, makers use images, composition, color, symbolism and metaphor, visual metaphor, and materials to communicate meaning. So if we look at this image on the left here by Polly Noor, I just want you to think about, what do you think the artist is trying to communicate here? Just sit with that, look at, and think about how the artist is using design elements to create and communicate a message. I feel maybe there's a message of overwhelm, of being caught, of being stuck, of being tangled up. You may see something else. And that's really what the art critique and art interpretation process is. We bring into art interpretation what we have experienced or what we kind of believe to understand. But I wonder what you think about this image. So again, I mentioned that art and design overlap quite frequently. There's more similarities there than we might think. Really, they structure and support creativity. So art and design overlap in a lot of ways because they're both forms of visual communication, right? One might be trying to engage an audience for a thing, and the other might be trying to communicate meaning or an idea. But they both rely on creativity, aesthetics, and problem solving. While fine art is often more focused on personal expression, emotion, or exploring ideas, like being stuck or tangled or unable to move, design is usually more focused on function, right? Why do you want to buy this coffee cup that's for sale at the store, right? Does it keep coffee warmer? Is it more durable than other coffee cups? So it's also more targeted towards that audience and its usability. However, both disciplines use the same foundational visual elements like line, color, shape, composition, scale, and balance to create meaning and to engage viewers. The boundaries between art and design are often fluid. They go back and forth. So, whether or not you're taking this course because it's a foundational requirement to build your visual fine art practice, or you're taking this because you want to go into more of a graphic design commercial field, you will find that the elements in art and design interact and weave within each other. Designers regularly draw from artistic movements and techniques to create stronger visual impact, while artists frequently use principles of design to organize and structure their work. These come innate with making. So a lot of the elements and principles that you're going to learn this summer are probably ideas that you've already been doing innately as a creator. They just come instinctually. This course just gives words to that. With contemporary digital tools, these lines blur even more, creating hybrid creative approaches that combine artistic experimentation with design thinking. Again, we can see this overlap across many disciplines. Graphic design can function as both communication and artistic expression. Interior design combines practical space planning with atmosphere and emotional experience. Product design merges functionality with aesthetics and form. And in both art and design, creators use visual language to tell stories, communicate ideas, evoke emotions, and shape how people experience the world. This all becomes part of what we might say is visual culture. And I'll talk a little bit about visual culture in a moment. The design process really means to plan and to organize. Design is inherent in the full range of art disciplines, from painting and drawing to sculpture to photography and to time-based media such as film, video, computer graphics, and animation. When we talk about design in this class, we are discussing the act of creative problem solving that is integral to all disciplines in 2 dimensions, right? Even though it exists outside of 2 dimensions, like 3-dimensional and sculptural practices, we're going to be focusing on the act of creative problem solving that is integral to all disciplines. So we're not going to get caught up in the difference between fine art and design for commercial standards. We're going to be really thinking about creative problem solving and how that's applicable across all 2D media. So what do we think of when we think of creative problem solving, right? So much of creative making, art practice, making practice, is centered around finding a solution creatively to a problem that has been presented. Now, whether that problem is an assignment I have given you, or it's a way to visually express or communicate something that is important to you, or to develop an ad for a company you will work with, you are creatively answering a set of questions. So when you're faced with a creative problem-solving task, whether in this class or in your own practice, I want you to ask yourselves first, and you could do this in your sketchbook for every project, even if it's a sketchbook assignment. What is the question I'm trying to answer? What is the problem I am finding a solution to? What are the guidelines, components, instructions that I need to follow? For this class, make sure you underline and bold that. You might get a creative concept that you feel really great about and then forget about all of the guidelines. In this course, you need to be able to follow those guidelines, components, and instructions. It's an important practice in your art career that will translate outside of this, whether you're applying for a grant in the future, an exhibition in the future, or a job. Being able to make sure all those guidelines, components, and instructions are met is critical. Sometimes the concept takes over and you throw everything else out the window, but make sure you go back to that assignment sheet and make sure you're meeting all of that criteria. And then you're going to ask, what am I trying to communicate? What is the relevance of the piece, the idea, the artwork? Who is my audience? Is there a message to this work? Or is the message beautiful aesthetics or disruptive aesthetics, right? Or is there a visual language and communicative message that you're trying to convey? All of that is interrelated and overlapping. What are my goals and how do I get there? So I want to talk just a little bit about visual culture because it's the world that we live in. So in the broadest sense, visual culture means everything that can be seen of a culture or society. Anything from buildings to clothing to dishes to anything in your everyday daily life. For our purposes, we're going to use the term for imagery and visuals that a society produces. So before we can fully understand art and design, we also need to understand the larger visual culture they exist within. We are constantly surrounded by images, advertisements, films, social media, fashion, architecture, branding, photography, interfaces, and in entertainment media, all that shape how we see ourselves and the world around us. Visual culture examines how images communicate, influence behavior, construct identity, reflect social values, and circulate across society. For this next part, that's going to be really important for you to think about as I talk through some of these next images. Visual culture examines how images communicate, influence behavior, construct identity, reflect social values, and circulate across society. Art and design do not exist separate of each other in isolation. They are part of a much larger network of visual references, trends, symbols, and shared cultural meaning. There's a collective unconscious sometimes that occurs within art and design. And by studying visual culture, we begin to understand not only what images look like, but what they can do. Context is also critical and important when looking to decode and understand an image in its context of visual culture. So we use context to understand an image. Context can include time in history it was made, where the image is made, the country, the city, etc., the society, customs and beliefs it was made in, and what images came before. So I want you to think about this image of Frida Kahlo, a Mexican painter who has been classified as surreal, but in her own statements about her work would not identify as a surreal painter. I believe she said she paints her reality. This is called Diego in My Thoughts. Frida Kahlo had a tumultuous marriage and relationship with Diego Rivera, who is also a Mexican painter of the same era. Here she's in a traditional garment of her culture with Diego in her forehead and branches and vines and roots branching out from around her face and this floral headdress. A ton of symbolism imbued in Frida Kahlo's work. In this particular piece, we can appreciate this for its aesthetic value, for its use of balance, for its use of emphasis and focal point, which we'll talk about, for its use of this visual rhythm that causes the viewer to look around the painting. But there's also a lot of context that's imbued in this piece that's specific to the history it was made in, the customs and traditions of that culture, and the inner relationship between Frida Kahlo and Diego. So we can appreciate this based on its aesthetic nature alone, right? The elements and principles that go into the design of this to make it an interesting piece to look at. But the context and the symbolism makes it a deeper piece that's communicating something visually. It's using these design elements and principles to communicate a different message visually. So the next images I just want to use to show you how visual culture is repetitive, it's in the world around us, and it's highly influential in the art practice and art making, and how it overlaps with fine art and design. So the top image is Garden of Earthly Delights, painted in the 16th century by Hieronymus Bosch. In the bottom, we see an image painted by Salvador Dali in 1943. Similar imagery, similar use of design principles and elements, very much reminiscent, very much inspired by, right? So Salvador Dali is inspired by Hieronymus Bosch, both fine art interpretations of this contextual meaning. Next, we move into the 21st century. We have an art photograph by Eric Craig called Dali Egg, right? This Dali Egg is clearly inspired by Salvador Dali. That was clearly inspired by Hieronymus Bosch. Then we move on to advertisement. So now we're moving from fine art, right? Visual, cultural, historical repetition of context and imagery and aesthetics, to a more commercial design use of similar aesthetics and similar symbolism. This is the Dali pen from Penporium that is used, that Dali egg, right, which is really the Hieronymus Bosch egg, to sell a pen. Now that pen, you might recognize this imagery here of the elongated features as a Dali, right? This 1946 painting of Salvador Dali, The Temptation of St. Anthony, shows those very exaggerated elongated legs that we see on this pen, right? So that elephant that we see in Dali's painting has now inspired a commercial product, a pen, by Penporium. So this context and virtual culture is repetitive, it is overlapping, and it is highly influential. Then we see this repeated again in this piece, Soul Chaser 2, right? With those elongated forms, this sculpture made out of bronze, more contemporary. And we see an artist, Jin Kai, replicating this Dali painting, the pen product from Legos. So even moving, right, this piece that was made in the early 20th century is now moving into current, almost pop culture, which brings us to Lady Gaga. In her 2010 musical performance for the Royal Variety, we can see Dali's legs highly influencing pop culture in the legs of her piano that she used for this performance. Lady Gaga is highly referencing fine art, art history, and referencing current and past pop culture. The last piece I'll share is Lady Gaga's infamous meat dress that came into the scene in 2010 that caused a raucous reaction in the community. Here is her meet dress in 2010, but what people might not realize is that this was calling back to and referential of the flesh dress for an albino anorectic from 1987 with the artist Jana Sturback. So we can see here that visual culture is a continuous conversation where ideas, forms, and symbols are repeated and borrowed, transformed, and reimagined. They circulate, transform, and gain new meaning as they move across art, design, fashion, advertising, film, digital media, and everyday life. Creativity expression is often built through reference, like the several examples of reference we saw, adaptation, taking something old and adapting it into a new current aesthetic, remixing, and reinterpretation. Understanding context helps us recognize that art does not emerge from nowhere. Every artwork is shaped by the artist's experiences, the culture, the historical moment, available materials, influences, and technical knowledge. Context allows us to better understand not only what we are looking at, but why it was made and how meaning is constructed. At the same time, understanding context reminds us that artistic skill and creative practice are evolutionary. Artists develop through experimentation, repetition, influence, failure, observation, and growth over time. No artist begins as a master. Creative work is built layer by layer through process, learning, and adaptation. This video that I'm going to play explores the idea of artistic evolution, how artists develop skills and visual language over time rather than arriving fully formed. It's by Ira Glass, who's the host of a radio show called This American Life, and he talks about this evolution as an emerging maker, creator, and what it's like to start with a lot of ideas and tastes, but not yet that skill development. So I'll play that for you now. Oh, it is not playing. I will share it as a separate clip after this video. Okay, so to close, when we think about creativity, it's easy to imagine artists suddenly having brilliant ideas. But most creative work actually develops through process and practice, through failure and solutions. Artists and designers constantly move between thinking critically, observing and looking carefully, and experimenting and doing through action. In many ways, creativity is less about having the perfect idea immediately and the perfect outcome immediately, and more about learning through cycles of thinking, looking, and doing, from a cyclical approach to creative problem solving. We think by generating ideas, asking questions, and reflecting critically. We look by observing the world, studying materials, images, and visual relationships, and learning from what already exists. And we do by experimenting, making, testing, messing up, revising, and responding through action. Creativity happens through the interaction of all three, not as a straight line, but as an ongoing process of reflection, observation, and practice. Think critically, look closely, and do experimentally. Thank you so much for joining this course. Please stay inspired, keep experimenting, and let your art speak. Let me know if you have any questions along the way, and I really look forward to seeing what you create this term.